Thank you, Rabbi Kamen, for those beautiful words. This might be a good time to turn off your cell phones. And if you brought candy with you, why don't you unwrap it now? I don't know who thought of that one. You're all educators. I bless you that you should have the nachas from your students that I get from mine. It is a miracle in my life that I've been doing this long enough that I travel around North America, and there are people that I have loved for a long time who are doing extraordinary things I would never have thought of, and they're doing it really, really well. And then they turn and they say, "You were my teacher," and I don't know what they're saying. So thank you for that. Two stories. It is taught of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, that on one Kol Nidre evening, he entered the synagogue and he went up to the Amud, the prayer stand, to launch the service of atonement. And he held on to the structure and was silent. And it got very awkward. People started squirming and not knowing why wasn't the rabbi singing, what's going on. And so finally, one of his students approached him and said, "Master, it's time to begin. Why are you not starting?" And he said, "Because this place is so filled with the egos of the people in this room that there's no space to let God in." No space to let God in. Story number 2. Moses and the children of Israel are fleeing Pharaoh's armies. And on the march, when Pharaoh changes his mind, and he decides that he's going to prevent them from leaving. So he unleashes his soldiers and his chariots, and he chases after them. And the Israelites find themselves in the terrifying position of being at the shore of an impassable sea with the Egyptian army fast approaching. And the sea doesn't split. And finally, one Israelite, Nachshon ben Aminadav, says, "It's up to me to make the sea split." And he leaps in, and when he gets up to his nostrils, when his nose goes underwater, how do we know that, by the way? Because of mi kamocha. Right? At that moment, the sea splits. One is a story about the toxic nature of ego. One is a story about the saving power of ego. Had Nachshon not taken it upon himself to jump, we would have perished by the sea. Had the people in the congregation not been so filled with their own significance, the Baal Shem Tov would have started the service on time, which would have changed all of Jewish history after that. The reason I wanted to start with those two stories is that most of the time when rabbis preach about ego, they preach a message that is artificially black and white. Ego is bad. You shouldn't have any. You should be humble. Humble is good. Now, maybe charitably, they say that because there aren't a whole lot of Jews who they think need to have their egos bolstered. But this isn't true. You and I know many Jews who have been so battered in the world that they have forgotten to stand up. And I assume you and I know that often bravado and pushiness is in fact not a sign of excessive ego. It's a sign of deflated ego. It's a compensation. So I want us to get off our high horse. I want us to recognize how very complicated it is to be human. How very difficult it is to be human. And I want us to have an honest conversation about what healthy ego and appropriate humility look like. Because like all human traits, like all biological traits, it's not the case that if something is good, then more of it is better. You can have an optimal amount of saline in your system, and having more than that doesn't make you healthier, right? You can have an optimal amount of dark chocolate. You can have an optimal amount of dark chocolate. I keep trying to find my limit. Right? Biological systems don't work by maximization. They work to optimization. What is that optimal level? How do we integrate humility and ambition such that we know when to take a stand in the world, when to assert ourselves, when to have appropriate pride in achievements and to mobilize ourselves for new achievements? When do we raise our hand and say, I can do that, I'll take care of that? And when does it cross the line and become a pathology? When does it become an imposition on others and a compensation for our own sense of smallness? That's what I want us to think about. I'm sure you would agree with me that Jewish history, like world history, is filled with astonishing figures whose blend of ego and humility shined great light in their times, are the beneficiaries of their chutzpah. But I want us to, before we project it out into the world, I also want us to be honest and say we're really each talking about ourselves too. Finding that integration of humility and of ego assertion is something that every human being ought to be struggling with. My teacher, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, alav hashalom, who was a vice chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the founding president of the American Jewish University, one of the great rabbis of Har Zion congregation in Philadelphia, founding president of United Synagogue of Conservative Jews. The man did basically everything. I remember asking him at his 90th birthday, at what point did it start to feel natural being a rabbi? And he said, I'll let you know. That's humility. And yet, when there were causes that he could make a difference in, he did. That's ego. But it was grounded in a pervasive sense of two virtues that I want to propose to you as the measuring yardstick for is this healthy or is this not? The first is a deep and rooted sense of gratitude. To those of you who are here this morning, I reminded you that you are the culminating chapter in a story that is 14 billion years old. The rabbis teach, why was it that human beings were created last? Which, by the way, whether you take the Bible literally or you go for the Darwinian version, still remains accurate. Why was it people were created last? And the rabbis say, it is like inviting an honored guest to a banquet. First, you prepare the banquet. Then you let the guest in. Right? And so, we have been born into a world uniquely prepared for us. And that ought to inspire in us a sense of enormous gratitude to the cosmos as a whole and to its maker. But it doesn't stop there. We are not only the products of evolutionary biology and cosmology, but we are, and I speak here with great pride, mixed bag. In gay circles, pride is a really good thing. In Hebrew, pride is a bad thing. Right? But with pride, that we are part of an ancient heritage that taught the world, among other things, all people are created equal, not just Jews, not just men, but both created by God, both reflecting the divine image, and that pertains to all humanity, not simply to us. We are the ones who first announced to the world that workers have a right to a day of rest, that you do not own someone's labor, and that they have a right beyond your capacity to intervene to take a day off. That's an awkward word, isn't it? The day that we spend with people we love is a day off, and the day we hang out with people that you have to pay us to be with, that's our day on. That's another talk for another time. We are the people who taught the world that our relationship to the earth should be one of stewards, in which we maintain the earth's well-being, not for our own sake, but for the world's sake. And therefore we leave the ground fallow every 7 years and every 7 times 7 years. We respect the integrity of the world that we caretake, but do not own. There are so many ways in which our heritage has been a beacon for the world that I am overwhelmed by gratitude simply for having been a Jew. And in both cases, well, let me add one more. We are living in the optimal moment of human history. I know people don't like to say that, because what we like to do is say that things are awful, and the world is terrible, and things are getting worse by the minute, and it's never been this bad. We particularly like to say that if we're not occupying the White House at the given moment, right? But let me say, Democrats and Republicans alike, you are allowed to fetch all you want for the next 2 years. This is still the greatest country that the world has ever known, and this is the greatest moment in human history. More people are being fed, more people are getting health care, more diseases are being conquered, more people are being included in a growing democracy that's spreading around the world. I'm sorry to tell you, things are better than they have ever been. Sorry, deal with it. That doesn't mean they're not crappy, it just means they're better than they've ever been. With gratitude, with mindful gratitude, comes responsibility. If we are privileged to be the caretakers for all life, if we are the ones aware of the miracle of being alive, of the glory of being Americans, of the privilege of being Jews, then that summons us to a great responsibility. The well-being of the planet, the advancement of freedom and democracy, the thriving of Judaism in all its diversity and all of its vitality. And that means that if you feel summoned to respond, and you honestly ask yourself, is this about gratifying my own desire for attention, or is this about service to something embracing and something higher? Sometimes you'll honestly admit it's the wrong motivation. Sometimes you'll admit it's both. And sometimes you'll say that's good enough. The fact that I enjoy a life of service should not stop me from a life of service. And we are all called to serve. So gratitude has to be one of the routes by which we examine why we're doing this. And the second is outcome. Is the world made better by my engaging in this behavior, even with improper motives? So, many of you I know are fans of Dennis Prager. I have been friends with Dennis for many decades. Dennis asks an interesting question. Who is the more moral person? The person who walks past a street person, engages in conversation, but says, I don't have money to give you right now. Or the person who walks by, doesn't talk to the person, takes out a $10 bill, hands it to the person, and walks on. Who's done the greater good? Some would say the first guy. Dennis and I wouldn't. The optimal one, obviously, is you talk to the person, you have a conversation, and then you give the person $10, obviously. But I can tell you that at the times of my life where I've needed money, the conversation was just filler until someone gave me the money I needed. So it's the actual stepping up to help that counts. And sometimes what we do is we behave the way we're supposed to behave and wait for the right motives to come. But if you don't do the right thing until the motives are there, it's entirely possible that by the time you have the right motivation, you won't act at all. So where does that leave us? Can you look at the needs of our community and the needs of our people, and can you discern a call? I'm quiet now so you can think about that. Do you feel called? The philosopher Levinas says that the most naked part of a human being are their eyes. Because when you look at the eyes of another, you see eyes that are like your own. And so in looking at the eyes, if you actually see the eyes, you see that that other has needs precisely like you do. And it would be purely arbitrary to think that you're only responsible for your own needs and not for theirs. So in looking at the eyes of the other, we realize that we have an instant obligation to them because of our shared humanity. That's what I think it means for Jews to feel called. To feel the sense that I must do this. Now, mention has been made of great Jewish figures who were called and whose first response was tevius. Choose somebody else. Right? So Moses famously is called and puts up a good fight. But that's already starting the story too late. Moses, recall, is the Harry Potter of his age. Remember? He's sent to be raised by Muggle relatives who admittedly live in a kind of Bel Air mansion. And he doesn't know who his actual parentage is or who his actual identity is. But even while living in the palace, he sees an Egyptian overseer pummeling a Jewish slave. and he is filled with rage and a sense that he has to stop it, which he does by killing the man. Okay? Moses' hearing the call came before he got the call. It came because he saw the eyes. It came because of sheer humanity. And that makes it a healthy thing, right? So here's the model of Jewish humility and ambition. The word that the great philosopher Walter Kaufmann coined was humbition. Humbition is that artful blend of humility and ambition that we all need to cultivate. So humbition is, Moses sees someone being oppressed, he can't stand it. Can't stand it doesn't mean he orders people in the palace to do something about it. That would be reflective. That would mean I step back and I think about it. He doesn't have time to step back and think, there's someone suffering, I need to do something. And then when he does what he does, he realizes that changes my life forever. There's no going back. Once you see someone's humanity, then it's not a question of whether, it's only a question of when. Once the liberal movement started to debate, should we ordain women, it was a done deal. All we could do, those who wanted to, was put up a rearguard effort to try to slow it down. But the minute you sit down to have a conversation, are women equal or not, you're already done. It's just a matter of time. The minute we started to talk about, should we ordain gays and should we perform gay weddings? By the way, I just want to point out, there's no phrase gay doctorate. Right? So someday I look forward to there not being gay marriage, in the sense that you're either married or you're not. Right? You're either a doctor or you're not. If you're gay, that's fine. I think the most horrible blow to my liberal theology came the day that I was talking to a lesbian couple and I heard them fighting over the thermostat. I assumed that was the single greatest advantage to being gay. There is no advantage. Once you engage the question, should we recognize the love of these people, you've already decided what the outcome is. You can just try to fight to slow it down, but it's done. And that's true for all the great social justice and human dignity questions. The minute it becomes a question, it's irrevocable. All we're doing is battling out how long it's going to take and how many movies your grandchildren will make in which you look like an idiot. By the way, it takes about 25 years these days, so you better hope you're not one of the ones who live very long. So Moses sees the eyes. He sees the suffering, he acts, and then that changes the subsequent course of his life. And that's when he flees. He flees because the enormity of his new reality is terrifying. What does it mean to live in a world in which there are no Israelite slaves? That's just unnatural, isn't it? That's bizarre. What does it mean to stand up to the divinely ordained laws of Pharaoh and say, no, I don't care who orders it, it's wrong. And so disoriented Moses flees out, I love this, to the midbar, to the wildness, right? Because his life has gone wild. But wild, I want to tell you, wild is where creation happens. I remind you that in the book of Genesis, where does the Spirit of God, the wind of God, flutter? It flutters over the undomesticated deep, over the Tehom. That's where all creativity happens. That's where all novelty emerges. That's where all new visions come. They don't come from the place of habit or conformity. They come from someone who says, we're not doing it that way anymore. The first women's conference, which took place in upstate New York, the women needed their husband's permission to organize the conference. Isn't that amazing? One of the few men to attend the conference was Frederick Douglass. Because he got it. Either we are all of us free, or we are none of us free. You can't compromise. There isn't some freedom. There either is or isn't. So he was there. First woman who walked down the streets of New York showing an inch of her ankles had stones thrown at her for immodest behavior. You can only pray that the little boys who threw rocks at her are reborn in the village today. And that will be hell enough. In the wild, in the wilderness, where there is no human convention to blind us, where the night sky is dark enough that the stars can enlighten us, there, Moses again shows himself truly. He comes to a well. He's tired, thirsty, hungry presumably. He's fled everything he knows, all social convention. And there at the well, he sees something radical. Yes, shepherds, but the shepherds are girls. And these women, they start to try to water their flock, and a bunch of bullies, male obviously, push them away and insist on privilege. We're going to water our flocks first. And what does Moses do again for the second time in his life? He doesn't think. He doesn't think. He acts, and he chases them away, and then he helps the women to water their flock, and then he goes, God, I did it again. And the reward is, he's brought home by these shepherd women, and he marries into the family. Because the Bedouin know that social convention has to give way before humanity. And that's when he hears the voice. Not after the first time, but after the second time. That's when he hears the voice tell him, you are the one I have selected. You will free my people. And that's when he shows us this isn't about ego. We know that Moses is a liberator. He's been a liberator for quite some time now. His humility is that he says, I don't think I can do this, God. I'm not the guy who's the smooth talker. I'm not the charismatic one. I don't have troops behind me. Send someone else. But this is to send someone else of someone who every time he sees injustice, he stops it. And God's response is, you're not going alone. You'll go with your brother, you'll go with your sister, and you will go with me. And I will liberate those people through you. I believe, along with the Hasidic tradition, that the stories in the Torah are true not as a matter of ancient history, but as the outward projection of our innermost truth. We are Moses. We are the daughter shepherds. We are the Israelite slave, the Egyptian overseer, and Pharaoh. It is our inner struggle projected out in story form, so that we can tell the story, and then we get a simple decision. How are you going to live your life? Are you going to live your life as Pharaoh to someone? Will you live your life as the kind of taskmaster who imposes unjust social convention on people because that's the way it is? Or will you rise up? Will you be, for us, a Moses? Was Moses egotistical? He's remembered as the most humble person in the Torah. I just want to remind you that somehow being the most humble person in the Torah includes walking into Pharaoh's court and telling him you're going to let these people go. Not once, but again and again and again. It involves turning the water into blood. It involves causing locust and hail and plague. It involves fighting with the leaders of the Jewish people, itself an exhausting task. It involves marching them out of Egypt. It involves arguing with God. It involves splitting the sea. This is the humble guy. That's the humble guy. And there is an arrogant guy in the story. And he's a weird one. Out in the wilderness, again, there's a guy who turns to Moses and says, "Who made you our boss? We don't have to listen to you. We should be able to do whatever we want." And he gets swallowed by the earth. Because he used the language of popularism, but the purpose of his language was to reinforce stasis. We're not moving forward. We're not going to create a different kind of culture. We, all of us, should have access to privilege, not you, and we're not going anywhere. He gets buried alive. Right? Because sometimes ego can clothe itself in social propriety, or in established norms, or even in progressive language. There's nowhere where ego can't hide. Some of you have heard me tell this Talmudic tale. It is said that all human beings have a Yetzer Tov, a good impulse, and a Yetzer Hara, an evil impulse. And the rabbis said to God, "This makes no sense, boss. Right? If you want people to do good deeds, why don't you just get rid of the Yetzer Hara? And then everyone will do good." So God gave the rabbis permission to tie up the Yetzer Hara. The power of a sage is vast. So they did. They tied up the Yetzer Hara such that he had no power anymore. And from the moment he was tied up, the Talmud says, no chicken laid an egg. No artist created something new. No carpenter built anything. Because the Yetzer Hara is a source for all of that. So the rabbis, stymied and a little embarrassed, they went back to God and they said, well, what do we do? Like, we can't not have babies, we can't not have new creations, we can't respond to life, we got to do that. And God said, let him go. So what the rabbis did was, right before they untied the Yetzer Hara, They blinded it in one eye, so at least it shouldn't be as powerful as it used to be. And then they let him loose. I take this story to tell us that our task as human beings is not to remove all ego. That task is both impossible and dangerous. Because in the act of trying to squelch your ego, you will be tempted to be so proud of how ego-free you are that you will become impossible to everyone around you. No, the task we have, and the task that Judaism holds out to us, is to channel our ego into constructive ways that engage us to improve the world and to care for each other. Use your ego to get involved in helping the weak and the outcast and the lonely and the oppressed. If that makes you feel good about yourself, great. Feel good about yourself for that. Use your ego to make you volunteer at your school, your hospital, your synagogue, your camp, wherever it is, so that you're the first to volunteer to do good. And feel great when whoever is there calls out your name on the list of those who responded. You should feel good about that. And if that's what ego means, then I want to affirm the rabbinic insistence that we need ego in Jewish life. Look, we have been treated these past 2 days to great artists who have poured their souls out for our benefit. Do any of you think that the world would be a better place if they were so stripped of ego needs that they never performed again? I don't think so. I'm grateful to you guys for what you've done, right? Because they show us the channeling of ego into the construction of human community. And that's the answer. Ambition. About your own personal glory, strive to be indifferent. The past president of American Jewish University, when I started working there, gave me a piece of advice I have never forgotten. Dr. David Lieber said to me, you can accomplish anything so long as you don't worry about who gets the credit. Absolutely true. So, for the transformation of the world, be ambitious. For the possibility of translating God's vision of a world of love and compassion and justice, be ambitious and be relentless. To see your own name in lights and those of your colleagues in the dark and in the dust, resist. Here's the good news, friends. 100 years from now, nobody will remember any of us. But the world will be different by the deeds we leave behind. The spark of wisdom that could be passed from one generation to the next. A child who is raised with enough self-love that she is able to go out in the world and in turn raise a child who loves herself. A piece of art, of poetry, of music that the world can sing long after we're gone and when they don't remember who wrote it. Like the tide, we leave a new layer of sand. For the perfection of the world, be ambitious. For the dawning of a new justice that shines on each of us alike and leaves no one cold and lonely and shivering on the outside. Be ambitious. For a Jewish community unafraid to stand in the light, to take its place among the world wisdom traditions, not in a spirit of competition or supremacy, but in a spirit of broad and deep complementarity. We, with our Muslim brothers and sisters, with our Christian brothers and sisters, with our gay and straight and trans brothers and sisters, with our atheist brothers and sisters, we will all of us share wisdom such that nobody walks around in the dark anymore. And nobody is allowed to stumble without being lifted up. For that, be ambitious. And for your own person, know that you are known and loved by the one who never perishes. And let that be for you sufficient. Thank you very much.